Welcome back, everyone. This is John Mihaljevic, welcoming you to this live session at European Investing Summit 2012. And it's a distinct pleasure to have with us Jochen Wermuth, who is the Chief Investment Officer and Managing Partner of Wermuth Asset Management. Oliver will introduce Jochen. Jochen will then share his remarks with us for about 20 to 30 minutes, at which point we will open the floor to your questions. While Jochen is presenting, feel free to type your questions into the online interface and be sure to state your affiliation as well. Without further ado, Oliver, please take it away. I will just point out one thing, which is that this session is being recorded and will be made available on our conference website within 24 hours. Oliver, go ahead, please.
Thank you, John, and it's a great honor to have with us Jochen Wermuth, the Chief Investment Officer of Wermuth Asset Management. When it comes to investing in Russia, we could not be more fortunate than to have Jochen's experience and perspective with us here. As it happens, Jochen will be presenting to Prime Minister Medvedev this Sunday on Russian economic scenarios on behalf of the World Economic Forum. So fire away with questions. Here's a rare opportunity to interact with someone who is really shaping Russia's policies and is able to interact on a very high level in Russia. So of course investors have struggled with Russia for a long time. Some investors exclude Russia from Europe, and the issues are certainly well known, but perhaps less well understood. So we're definitely in good hands here with Jochen to understand better how investors can go about finding value in this truly neglected part of Europe. Jochen, with that, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Oliver and John. Just one question. If people do ask questions, you will interrupt me and shoot them at me, or how does that work?
Jochen,
in the course of the presentation?
Well, our preference is to wait till the end of the presentation and then start with a Q&A, unless you'd like to pause along the way and see if there are any questions. That's really up to you. But we're going to let you present until you let us know that you're ready for questions.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll go ahead then. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to listen to something that many people stopped listening to. My colleague put together this great title, Klondike or El Dorado. I had to look up what both meant to work out what it really means I'm talking about, but I guess it means Klondike is a real successful gold dig, and El Dorado nobody's really found yet. And so this is what this is about. Is there true amazing opportunity in Russia, or is it always looking shiny but we never actually get to it and we'll never be able to capture the opportunity? If you look at the background of who we are and what we do, we are initially just a family office running our own money, which we've made this working in at Deutsche Bank, and previously my family worked in the forestry business. And after a while we found out it makes a bit more sense to get better leverage in terms of access to information and size of organization, to also taking co-investments from other families or other investors in the shape of forms of funds we advised. And over the years we've invested about $1 billion in Russia, and we've done this on the basis of value investing principles for the majority of our investments. Simply because when I was trying to finance my studies, I translated the Midas Touch about Warren Buffett and the Intelligent Investor by Graham and Dodd into German, and ever since I thought this made a whole lot of sense. Why buy something that's fashionable, buy something that's fundamentally cheap? And on that basis, on the one hand, Russia is of course heaven, and as Warren Buffett puts it, one feels like a mosquito on a nude beach in Moscow and in Russia any day. The opportunities are just fantastic. But of course, there are also macro issues to consider, and I'm very happy and fortunate to have my father, Dieter Wermuth, as our chief economist with us, who's been able to guide us on the macro front. And again, if you look at the macro front and the Russian situation, you probably couldn't find a better credit, and you probably couldn't find a better place to put your money if you want to have a safe long-term bond investment, for example. The credit situation of the US or Germany, in fact, starts looking like Russia before the crisis in '98, while Russia with no debt looks fantastic. By way of background, maybe quickly, before we go into the formal presentation, I am German. My grandparents were obviously involved in 2 wars with Russia. The estimates are between 23 and 33 million war dead at the hands of Germans in Russia alone. And as a result, when I grew up and my grandfather told me about the war, I always thought it was good to try to make good and try to live in peace and friendship rather than to confront each other. And I also grew up with the benefit of my parents having studied in America on Fulbright scholarships, and was born in Boston and Massachusetts as a result, and learned quickly that the way that the US had treated Germany after World War II with the Marshall Plan and inviting students to come over on Fulbright scholarships really was a great way to treat a defeated nation and to turn Germany into one of the greater allies of America today, an ally of democracy, human rights, free trade. And I therefore felt that that's how we should probably approach Russia. And indeed, in the early 90s, the way that Russia was perceived by Helmut Kohl, our chancellor, and Bill Clinton was that this was an ally. The people who had been in power, came to power in Russia, had defeated the evil power, communism, and the Cold War enemy without a drop of blood in the heart of Russia, even though at the peripheries there have been some ethnic cleansing and some fights. But really a peaceful move to a country that declared to be a democratic country and that aimed to be a market economy. I happen to have written my master's thesis on East German, West German unification at Brown University and then later at Oxford, and therefore was one of a handful of people on earth who had ever looked at a transition from a planned economy to market economy. And at the tender age of 23, I ended up invited to consult or advise the Russian government as part of the European Union advisory efforts. And as you do when you're a young boy, you do economics 101 and you look at the economy, you say, well, GDP is $50 billion. Not a joke, $50 billion. You know, it's about twice the bailout that Cyprus is currently requesting. And I said, if you just sold oil and gas at world market prices, you could double GDP, basic net welfare gain analysis. And as you do at that age, you send a letter to the Prime Minister and said, that's what you should do. The ambassador quickly called me in and said, thank you very much, you don't write letters to the Prime Minister, and if you don't understand that, you go back to academia, thank you, and you're now fired. On the way to the airport, I received a phone call, could I please come to Stalin's dacha, please? And I thought, well, now I'm really in trouble. At Stalin's dacha, we had Prime Minister Gaidar and other advisors around the table, and a thundering voice came down and said, who wrote this memo? And why do you think you can figure this out? Why do you think we can't figure this out? It's completely silly. You can't export oil and gas from Russia because the pipeline capacity is constrained, so therefore your whole analysis is nonsense. And so that's not quite true. I called Houston, Texas, and they said with some goop you can double the throughput, and therefore you can double GDP. And he asked, well, how old are you, young man? I said, 23. And I said, how long have you been here? I said, 3 weeks. And do you speak a word of Russian? No. And he says, well, you're hired as an expert. And from that point in time, I knew about experts. And I said, well, don't quite get that. You know, I don't speak Russian. Why would you want that? And he says, who speaks Russian, young man? I said, I don't know. And he said, spies and communists. We want neither. And that's how, to my great surprise, and I think as an important point of information, not because I'm great, but because the Russian soul is great, the Russians invited a German to sit in the finance ministry of Russia and work there for 4 years in the heart of the Russian center of power, right on the Red Square. Imagine a German working in the finance ministry, the US Treasury, or American for that matter, in the German Treasury, or any other. The openness and welcomeness with which Russian reformers received Westerners to help them make the country free, to defeat communism and to defeat the evil power was really impressive at the time. I worked for 4 years with people that worked from 7 in the morning to midnight, 7 days a week to create a free market and democracy. And I'm very proud to say that you know, these people, I can put my hand in fire that they honest, hardworking, and when they left public service, they were still driving the cheap Soviet cars they drove before they got in, while of course there were others who were stealing billions. So when you think about Russia, before we go into this presentation, please keep in mind that aside from the evil impressions you have in the public domain of supposedly evil Cold War power again, and rich corruption, mafia, oligarchs, and so forth, there are also very many Russians who are very hard-working, honest, great people, intelligent, people that sent the first people to space, some of the greatest musicians, artists, and so forth, and that's what makes me passionate about Russia. Finally got me to marry a Russian woman, an ecologist dedicated to implementing the Kyoto Protocol, and doing a joint venture in terms of German-Russian children as well. So in terms of background, 4 years in the Russian government, getting to know the country's management from the inside. Then I worked for a couple of years with Deutsche Bank, setting it up from scratch. And basically the last 14 years we invested over $1 billion in Russia. We did so without ever having to pay a bribe or protection money. True, as I drive down the street in Moscow, the police stops you and says your license is out of date, or your tire pressure is not enough, or let us check if the car is really yours while I lock you up for 3 hours. But if you don't give in and you don't pay the $5 they're hoping for, the next time you drive by that police post, they say, it's the crazy German, and you go and you don't pay. And so if you drive a straight bargain and you don't compromise anywhere, then I think it is possible over again to do great investments and make great money in Russia by putting your foot down and insisting on what is common sense and what's one's rights. And this sort of activist value investing approach has earned us very good returns for many years, and we look forward to even greater returns now that the perception of Russia is at an all-time low again, even though to my mind the recent demonstrations by 100,000 people in the streets of Moscow is a clear sign that if people go out at -20 Celsius and demonstrate that this nation is strong and willing to stand up and demand human rights and demand closer cooperation with the rest of the world, and to achieve what every middle class in the world is asking for, and that's a very good sign. And frankly, the biggest negative I ever heard about Russia was, whatever you say is nonsense, Jochen, because in truth the Russians are genetically unable to think and demand democratic rights. They are simply genetically and historically not Slavs and slaves and unable. But the recent year has proven that's not the case. They're ready to stand up in great humor and demand the good things. So we're left with a situation which I think is one of, I guess, Klondike rather than El Dorado. I think it's a chance to really participate in seeing Russia change to become more of a normal country that we all know and in the West, and at the same time earn money for the hard work one has to do to make this happen. And let me talk to you about some of the opportunities in this process. If we turn to slide 4, which just tells you a little bit that I'm not from space, but we know why investors have fallen out of Russia. I always say Russia's reputation is 10 times worse than reality, and if you come to visit us in Moscow, you will see that it's a fantastic place and you'll enjoy it, and many amazing people. On the other hand, you will find that Russian reality is easily 10 times worse than it needs to be. Imagine an airport with international airport the size of JFK with one passport window and people queuing for 3 hours. Or imagine 3 major airports and for years and years no connection by train to the downtown. Or imagine a city with 17 million people and not a bus lane and not a taxi lane. So there's many, many ways to improve. The current situation in Russia is one where the valuations are extremely depressed, and extremely depressed both for perception reason and for real good reason. Key issues are that people see a high dependency on oil prices. They say, why should I invest in Russia? I can just buy a barrel of oil. Well, as I hope I'll be able to show you, there are great ways to make money in Russia, far beyond what you could make by buying a barrel of oil. And by the way, I wouldn't necessarily buy a barrel of oil because I don't think we can actually continue burning oil and gas the way we do without running into serious bottleneck. I believe that the reserves we discover today we can't burn anymore without achieving a major global heating effect, and we will then not enjoy the rest of the reserves unless we make a move quickly to renewables, in which case maybe oil is actually at risk. Russia is at risk because a global slowdown in the global economy following a crash in the Chinese housing bubble, which we think is actually bigger than the American bubble, not on official data, but on the grey economy loans. The lending has been bigger than America. And if that bubble burst, then commodity prices would come crashing and Russia would come crashing, because Russia today has about a 10% deficit if you don't count the oil revenue it has at the moment. However, the Russians have also dealt with this issue and have been world record holders in terms of avoiding what's called the Dutch disease. Thanks to Minister of Finance Kudrin, he took away 90% of the revenue on any oil exports above $20 a barrel and built one of the largest sovereign wealth funds to earth, abolished the deficits of Russia from 150% debt levels. They went to 10% debt level today, and they're running a budget surplus and a current account surplus second to none in the world today. Still, on the negative side, the government has increased its share in the economy following the 2008 crisis. Of course, not as much as America or West European nations, but still, there's been a rollback in privatized lands. Worse, possibly, I had a meeting about a year ago, or rather, I was at a public meeting with the President, now President Putin, where I had to say the following to him: "Happy birthday, Mr. Putin." And he said, "Well, it looks like we're having a party move and we have nothing to discuss." And I said, "Yes, I'm sorry, we have lots of serious things to discuss. I don't like when people laugh at me, and the problem is when I say, Mr. Putin, that you understand what's going on and you will fix it, people laugh at me both in Russia and outside of Russia, because when you started to come to power, Russia was about the 90th most corrupt country, and now it's about the 138th most corrupt country. When you came to power, about 6% of the population wanted to emigrate, and today about 22% of the population want to immigrate. People are very upset about this level of corruption, because corruption is not just a matter of small problems. I've seen people build aqua parks, siphoning off half the money to Cyprus or to Luxembourg or to Liechtenstein, and I warned them that you can't build an aqua park on half the budget, certainly not in a country with snow. And a year later, you had a picture of 40 people being decapitated from glass falling down from the roof of the aqua park. So corruption kills. It's not a joke. And it's a serious issue for everybody in the country, and people are sick and tired of it, and they want to change it. People are upset about the elections, which were manipulated in the sense that there was unfair access to the media, that it was impossible to register parties, lots of issues. However, with the demonstrations on the streets, there's now some positive move, and the elections of governors, for example, has been reintroduced. And last but not least, people are nervous now that to win the elections, a lot of expenses have been promised, and that could put a risk of the stability in Russia. The oil price now needs to be at $115 a barrel, which is quite high. When in the past, the Russian government always planned its budget on about half the current oil price. This year, they've planned a budget for oil price above current prices, and that, of course, is a problem in relative terms. Having said that, again, macro situation in Russia is very stable. Beyond that, of course, everybody has recently heard of the 3 girls dancing in a church and getting 3 years in prison, even though they have a 2-year-old daughter waiting for them at home, while the daughter of a local governor who killed a woman on the street in her car was given a 10-year delayed sentence to see her 3-year-old daughter grow up first. People have heard about Hermitage Capital, which has been expelled from the country and is fighting a war against the authorities that they claim have stolen assets from them. Their lawyer, whose colleague is our CFO for a while, has been, in essence, we believe, beaten to death in prison, and therefore Mr. Magnitsky died in prison in pre-trial detention, on the last day of his pre-trial detention. Horrible story, and the only good thing I can say about that is at least it's being published, at least it's being investigated, and hopefully the fact that things like this come out will change things for the better now. All of the Russians are aware that the issue is a big deal. There are other cases like the Georgian War, where the world, CNN ahead and Fox News ahead said it looked like Third World War starting, where in fact that wasn't the case. It was the Georgians that had attacked Russia, and Russians were there, Russian troops, that is, not Russia, were there to defend civil population, which was being protected under the United Nations mandate. But the negative press certainly has not ceased around the world. Of course, other issues going on with TNK, BP, lots of bad news, and the question is, will it ever end? come back to that in a second, and I'll take you quickly through some of the numbers on the macro picture. I, of course, would much more prefer to talk about individual companies, but I've been told I should speak about macro, while my colleague Sergei will speak tomorrow about the concrete companies we invest in. If we turn to slide 5, you will see that the equity risk premium in Russia is near all-time highs at 17% versus 3% from Brazil. Does that mean it's just Brazil is expensive or not? If you turn to slide 6, you'll see no. In fact, Russia is also trading at an all-time discount to its own average price-earnings ratio at about 58% discount to its own average price-earnings ratio. So it's really cheap on a historical basis as well. And it's trading at a major discount to BRIC peers. Sorry, I got that wrong. The 36% discount is to its own historical average, so 50% upside to what is Russia's average, given its bad perception, and 58% discount, or almost factor 3 upside, to the BRIC average, where I think Russia should be. That's also exemplified on slide 7, which just shows you the price-earnings ratios for various major indices, with Russia at a 5.3 price-earnings ratio today. So you can almost just buy the index if there weren't many caveats about that, like you would be buying companies that I wouldn't recommend you buy, even at a PE of 1. But basically at a 5.3 price-earnings ratio, Russia is very cheap compared to 9.4 for China, 15 for India, and 13.7 for Brazil. Now, how is this ever going to change? Well, the good news about the election promises made by Putin is that the budget is in trouble, and the budget needs to recover some money. So far, given that 50% of the index is made up of companies controlled by the state, the policy had recently been that these companies usually don't pay any dividends. They just sit on the money and, in essence, use the public-private joint partnership money to pay for public projects partially and not pay dividends. Now that the state needs some money, there's a new policy that has been agreed that a certain percentage of all the profits would go out as dividends at all times, imposing a discipline on these companies to actually return the cash to the shareholders and then look to get cash from the markets and compete with others to allocate market cash in an efficient fashion. So that should lead to an explosion in dividend yields and a major move in the Russian market. On slide 9, we just review the macro situation briefly again. The government debt at 10% of GDP, and more importantly, if you look at Japan or the US or other countries, overall debt in the economy can be 500% of GDP, consumer debt about 100% of GDP. In Russia, debt to GDP is only 3%. Now, you can, of course, be cynical about this, and if you default as a Soviet Union as 91, you restructure in 95, and then in 98 you do the first ever in history default on your domestic currency. You could have just printed money, but the Russians managed to default their own currency. Then, of course, very little debt is left. And also, if nobody trusts you over the years, then nobody lends you money, and you don't have much debt. And if the country overall has a bad credit rating, a bad reputation, then of course consumer loans are very low and mortgages are still at 14%. Anyway, whatever it was, the fact is now Russia has almost no debt. So while the whole world is burdened with a balance sheet recession, Russia has the ability to get to a healthy level of debt for the household, for example, and in particular as inflation is coming down from 10% or so to 3 or 4%, mortgage rates are coming down, and the housing boom is likely to happen, with 70% of the housing being derelict today. In fact, a boom across the whole economy is likely to happen, with the Russian economy consuming 10 times as much energy, 10 times as much as Germany per unit of GDP. So the amount of efficiency gains and productivity gains that Russia could achieve by adopting new technologies from the West is amazing, and that's why Russia is very keen on a modernization partnership, not just with Germany, but with the European Union, and very keen on the reset of relations with America as well. And as a result of all these good policies, Russia has the third largest foreign currency reserves, $500 billion, and just about a deficit this year of 1% of GDP. Also very important as you invest in Russia is that the ruble, according to the Big Mac index, according to the purchasing power parity, is seriously discounted to purchasing power parity at about 30%. So you probably have a 50% upside or even a doubling potential on your investments just because of the currency if you invest in local currency, you got to keep in mind that most of the stocks are traded in dollars offshore, so you need a special tool to get onto the local stocks it takes half a year, unfortunately, to open a local account or something. But if you go through a fund, you may be able to get access quickly, or you go through the pain of setting up an account. What does all this mean, and how can you make money out of this? And I'm running a bit out of time here. Because the market is driven by sentiment of foreign investors, it's a very weak domestic market, there's huge inefficiency, and people just follow the trends, and often they only follow the big blue chips, which are liquid, and the small cap stocks are completely ignored. And many people see a big boom, a consumer boom, and therefore invest in consumers or focus on best corporate governance company that they know, and they ignore the opportunities that exist outside of this, and this is exactly what we focus on. Here's an example of how perception and limit to outside stocks is a big issue. If you look at Wimbledon, which is a stock that we owned for about 3 years, from 2009, we bought it at a huge discount to what we thought was fair value, and we bought it at a huge discount to the stock that all the foreign investors were owning. Foreign investors were owning GDRs, which were trading at typically twice the price of the local stocks. Being able to trade the local stock, we're able to make the money, just double our money by a simple arbitrage trade, being short the offshore stock and long the onshore stock. Moreover, by the time that Wimbledon was bought by Pepsi Cola, the price exploded, and you could triple your money. If you talk another example, which is the case of Kalina, a company we've been on the board on and been involved in for a long time, we were being bid $3 a share, a ridiculous amount of money in January 2009. We held on to the share, and were able to get out at 10 times our money compared to that point later on. But then finally Unilever bought the company, and they bought it at twice our intrinsic value estimates. We had considered that $5 in January 2009 was a 90% safety margin. So stocks like that, which are owned by private individuals, which have a clear business model, clear moat, as you say in value investing terms, around their businesses, because very few other people could enter the local market the way they did in the fast-moving consumer goods space, you can make great investments. I think I will sort of come to an end at the next slide, which is page 13, with my favorite slide, and that's my math degree at Brown confirms to me that the simple identity, price earnings times earnings must be price. And of course, in the normal world, price earnings is your value investing home, and earnings is your growth investor home. Now, why are we potentially in nirvana in Russia? We're potentially in nirvana in Russia because we can buy value opportunities that are also growing very fast. We see an average PE of the companies we look at of about 3 to 5. And we believe that given the Russian government's intention to modernize, to bring in place the rule of law, to join, in essence, the European Union through 4 partnership agreements that are planned, that Russia will eventually be perceived as a normal country again and actually become more normal. And if we have a re-rating of Russia, we will probably have a factor 3 upside on the price-earnings ratios easily, just because the misperception is so large and reality is not as bad as it seems. But that's not all. The typical company we invested in have had 30, 40, 50% annual earnings growth, because the efficiency gains you can make simply by proper management, simply by proper behavior, simply by importing, say, normal technologies, which uses 10 times less energy than the Russians use at the moment, you can have huge earnings growth. But let's limit ourselves to the average growth of the economy. If the economy tuck us away over the next decade at a rate of 5 to 8%, which is what it's growing at the moment, and if on top of that you can double your exchange rate, you probably could see a tripling of dollar GDP from about 1.4 trillion to about 4.5 trillion. And so if the dollar GDP goes up by factor 3, and by the way, you're still at a level that's far below the European living standards, then your average company will probably see its earnings triple along with GDP. So we'll see the reason we put up with all the trouble in Russia is that we are looking for companies that will both triple in terms of earnings, price-earnings ratio. So we buy them at a 66% discount to intrinsic value, and who see their earnings explode. So 3 times 3 is 9, and that's what we try to focus on. But I think much more interesting would be to take your questions and give you some answers. My favorite movie, of course, being Woody Allen. All you ever wanted to know about sex, but never dared to ask, and just swap that for Russia, and I'm happy to be yours for answering questions, that is.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Jochen, thank you so much for those insightful remarks. I think Oliver has a question. I'll go to him in just a minute. Before that, we have a question from Elliot Turner of RGA Investment Advisors, and he basically says, I went into this wanting to dislike the idea of investing in Russia, but you've intrigued me. Can you talk a little more about Meshel and why other successful companies in the future won't share that fate?
Okay, yeah, Meshel is a great story and for some of the things that has made Russians furious and made people angry, and I think are driving home the message that things have to change. What I like to say about the macro situation is that the default of '98, the abolishment of a growing middle class, the disappointment, the unemployment, the poverty, the shock, has really caused the Russian government post-'98 to be really conservative and run only budget surplus and take the deficit, the debt down 150% to basically zero. That's the macro side. Macro side were a star in Russia. On the micro side, it took things like Meshel, where one day there's a meeting in a region of Russia, and the owner of Meshel is about to do an IPO in London, or a secondary placement in that case, and then President Putin, I believe, or Prime Minister, confusing story of course, said in a public statement, well, if you are sick and you can't even come meet me, I'll not just send you the doctor, I'll send you the secret police, and I'll send you the tax authorities, and they will fix you up. As a result of that, the stock price collapsed about 70% as the investors thought, well, you know, this guy is going to go out and destroy Meshel just as Yukos has been destroyed. As you will remember, the owner of Yukos has been put to prison, and shareholders in Yukos have lost billions of dollars over tax claims. Interestingly enough, on Yukos, the Court of Human Rights has actually found that the tax claims are probably right. So Russia's got the story wrong in terms of public relations. So everybody says that Russia is evil and so forth, or political and so forth. It may be the case that Mr. Khodorkovsky is in prison also for political reasons, but for the tax claims, the European Court of Human Rights has so far found it's probably right, and therefore there may have been no claim or no hope for shareholders other than the shareholders actually having invested with the wrong guy. I can tell you that having been a neighbor of one of the principals at Yukos in the early 90s, I became aware of business practices which I would not have ever gotten close to, and therefore we were never long Yukos, and I'm quite happy in that case. In the case of Meshel, I think it's a great company, and it's a big shame the way this message came across. And as you know, in Germany, the chairman of Deutsche Bank, Mr. Breuer, is being sued, or was being sued, for destroying a television company by making similar statements in public, which then really caused huge damage. And I think what has to happen in Russia, obviously, that these such statements should never be made, and more importantly, it shouldn't be the case that the opinion of one guy could drive down the value of the whole company. And so what's being done? We've put forward a number of proposals, like an ombudsman for investor rights, obviously clear rules under which you can appeal to the international courts in case you're being abused. And so the reason that we have so many Russians on the street between last fall and this summer, and that the pressure is not disappearing, is that people are sick and tired of this sort of behavior. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to say here, is that this is probably as bad as it gets, because a bit more pressure, a bit more abuse, and I think people will be just too upset. I mean, it's not just the taxi drivers, it's now even the grandmothers that are watching TV, which is state-controlled, that are now saying enough is enough, the corruption and so forth. So I think the government understands that there's real pressure, and the business community is very strong now. There's 500,000 organized business owners. I'm a member of YPO, the Young Presidents Organization of Russia, which is finally growing very strongly as well. We just had 450 YPOers visiting Moscow, and they're very, very impressed with the sort of determination of the business people here and the political people here to make a difference at long last. Then, of course, you have to ask yourself the question, in the end of the day, what does Putin want? And here, the case that we're making is that in the end of the day, he wants to be Putin the Great. And I think he wants to be known as the guy who put people in prison, who stole money or became very rich, but he wants to be known as the guy who made Russia strong and who created the roads for democracy. And he has to move now very quickly to put in place rule of law. The vision that I have, and I think is the most likely outcome, is to aggressively turn to the European Union. In 2003 and 2006, 4 partnerships have been pre-negotiated. Free movement of people, free movement of goods, common laws and standards, so the acquis communautaire, and diplomas for doctors and education, and finally common security. All of this was subject to joining the World Trade Organization. This has finally happened. Russia is now not just part of the European Council for Human Rights, but also the World Trade Organization. The highest court in Russia for human rights issues is now in Strasbourg, and that's a key difference to where we were before. If you think of 2 countries in Asia that you know well, in both cases the father passed power to the son. One is Singapore, the greatest nation maybe in terms of fighting corruption and Swiss-like Asian business hub. The other is North Korea. Again, what's the difference between the 2 countries? There's one key difference. Lee Kuan Yew outsourced the highest legal power. The highest court in Singapore is in fact the High Court in London. And the highest court in Russia is in fact now the Court for Human Rights in Strasbourg. And what I am propagating and will be propagating this weekend is that Russia should do the same thing as applies to all other EU countries now, to have also commercial decisions taken by the highest court in Brussels rather than in a local court, thereby avoiding the perception that the executive power can do whatever they want and they can influence judges, which is why Mitchell fell 70%. And as the institutions are built, the fear of the Mitchell cases should disappear and things get better. Sorry, that was way too long as an answer. I promise to be shorter.
Thank you, Jochen. I think, Oliver, do you have a question for Jochen?
Jochen, I'm really curious to understand a bit better. You mentioned that you think Russia may, or the goal should be to be within a European Union. We've heard from some other presenters that there is a risk of a disintegration of the Eurozone, and it's quite interesting to hear from you. So can you help us understand a bit what do you see in terms of the probabilities that there is actually, at a time of crisis, that Europe comes more together and that Russia even becomes more part of Europe?
Yeah. I have to say that there's a huge discrepancy between the Anglo-Saxon perception of the European Union and the non-Anglo-Saxon perception of the European Union. The initial methane and steel and coal union between France and Germany and the Benelux was created to monitor the German economy not energizing itself to create arms and guns. And the European Union is therefore one of the greatest peace mechanisms in Europe, and I think Germany remains very firmly committed to it. We also had a key breakthrough decision about 4 weeks ago now, with the ECB basically committing that they are the buyer of last resort of any government debt, and they will issue as many euros as it'll take to defend the euro. That was a big breakthrough, and ever since I think it's become even more clear than before that the European Union is here to stay. Indeed, Mr. Putin answered to me when I proposed you should get closer to the European Union, come on, sort out your own debt problems first and then come back to talk to us. But having said that, there are real reasons why it makes sense for the Russians to adopt the acquis communautaire, the common law book of the European Union, and maybe to export some of the legal authorities, judicial authority, or import some EU lawyers. It makes lots of sense for Russia to import the technology, especially in energy efficiency and clean tech, from Europe that it needs to modernize. It makes sense to create jobs and growth in the European Union, and it makes sense to create jobs and growth and save energy in Russia. So first of all, I'm not even being in Cyprus today, which is struggling to get another bailout. I'm not very bearish on the European Union. I think the European Union is here to stay. And of course, if you travel all across Russia, which I recommend all of you to do, you will see fantastic landscapes, and you'll find out that in fact Russia is Europe all the way to Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsk, which is a tip of the Kamchatka Islands just north of Japan. All of this has been colonized and civilized, I guess that's the right word, I don't know, by European cultures. And yes, there are 87 different nationalities, Turkish and Mongol and French and Germans and all sorts of nationalities living across Russia, but they all have a common European culture all the way across this huge space, and they feel at home in Europe. And so I think that the future of Russia is very much turning to Europe. But the alternative, of course, is not to turn to Europe and then be probably washed away by the Chinese. If you take one region of Russia alone, let's say, call it Ohio, the state of Yakutia, it has the size of the European Union alone and has a population of 1 million people. And in the same space just south of the border, you have 1 billion people living in China. So Russia has the option to survive, I think, by teaming up with the European Union. And I don't see the European Union as weak. I find that the European Union only moves when there's stress, and I'm very happy there's been serious stress, so now they're finally moving to the only sensible situation in Europe, which is to be a federal state, and I think that's very likely to happen. With or without the UK, I don't know, but the federal state is about to happen with effectively the finance minister being Mr. Riegling, who is in charge of the European Stability Mechanism already. And that's in fact what the Greeks are looking for, a tough German to manage the finances and make them pay taxes. So that's where we are in Europe.
We go next to Tanya Dimitrova, who asked that on one of your slides you mentioned that M&A deals have generally been value destructive to the acquirer in Russia. Can you think of any examples where that has not been the case, or industries where we can continue to look for investment opportunities based on potential M&A flow in the future?
I wonder what slide you're referring to, but I mean, in the case of Unilever and Pepsi Cola, of course, we as shareholders of local shares made a lot of money. Of course, if you then look at the history of acquisitions through 2008, which of course led toward high valuations, people have lost money since. But I still see strong interest by many Western strategic investors across the Russian economy, really. As you will see from the presentation from Sergei Yezimov tomorrow, I see one of the greatest opportunities in the electricity distribution sector, where you can earn, according to the regulated asset base legislation, the price of electricity tariffs for distribution will be set such that the company will earn 11% yield on its regulated asset base. And these assets are now available in the market for a third of the regulated asset base. So you can buy effectively a government-guaranteed earnings yield of 33%, which is fantastic. And I think that's a target area for potential takeovers. Other areas remain the construction space, I would say. Huge opportunities there. Cement, I guess, areas like this. I don't know that oil and gas makes a lot of sense because, again, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to burn more oil and gas. But that's, yeah, and I think also the big consumer names may come up for acquisition.
I should mention that Tanya is a former healthcare investor who is currently an executive with strategic transactions team at Bristol Myers Squibb. So just to give you a perspective on where she's coming from. Jochen, as you mentioned, Sergei Yezimov will talk about his favorite investment idea in Russia tomorrow. Could you just maybe give us a sense of the industries where you're finding a lot of values, or anything other than one specific idea, any themes or trends where you say, you know what, corruption isn't as prevalent in that particular industry or doesn't affect equity values as much?
Yeah, well, first of all, it generally, when you have a level of corruption that's so high, it's very important to have pay even more attention to principal agent issues, and we find excellent value where the companies are built by private individuals and there's no state involvement. So if you take Wimbledon, built by Mr. Jakob Fili, or Kalina, built again by an individual, Timo Gareev, these are privately owned companies, and I think that's the key to success. Just look for privately owned companies where you can speak to the owner, and the owner manager is still on the floor. And I think that's the strength of Russia. You often have people who own 90, 80% of a company or 70% of the company, much more concentrated owner-manager situations than in the West, and that's a great opportunity. Where are the opportunities in Russia? What sectors? I think the key sector is that 70% of the housing stock needs to be replaced. So construction materials, energy efficiency materials. The consumer boom will continue. I think healthcare is a very, very important issue. There's a huge catch-up demand there. Terrible situation in the healthcare sector, and opportunity now as more Russians are wealthy and they pay for good healthcare services. A company like European Medical Centers, which has just been bought, may go public one of these days. Agriculture is a huge opportunity. 10% of the remaining arable land in the world is in Russia, so that offers a great opportunity. So there's a lot of different sectors. I would just stay away from oil and gas and government-owned sectors where there's a problem. Banking, of course, is a big opportunity. Mortgage lenders, again, 3% of GDP is mortgages so far. So these are sectors, if and when there are assets to buy, you could focus on.
Picking up on your mention of agriculture, there's a question from Emmanuel Seiti, who points to Jim Rogers' decision to take an advisor position with a Russian agricultural fund. And anything you make of that, and to what extent have you actually found opportunities related to agriculture?
Yeah. So Jim Rogers, of course, has famously said that the Ferrari drivers of the futures won't be the investment bankers, it will be the farmers. So coming to Russian fund is a very good decision. We have not participated in the IPOs of some of the listed companies like Black Earth Farming and others, because I think they were being IPO'd at the price of $7,000 a hectare, when we knew through our private equity and real estate businesses that you can buy hectares of land at $100 a hectare, so 1/70th the price that the IPO took place at. So it may make sense to go actually down the road into more private investments. We managed to buy 1.2 million hectares of forestry land and 800,000 cubic meters of cut wood per year for a cost of $10 million, an asset which in just 400 kilometers west in Finland would have cost $700 million, or 70 times as much. So one has to look out carefully if there are listed assets, but beyond the listed asset space, may well want to have the ability to buy into private deals in agriculture. There are opportunities en masse.
Well, with that, Jochen, we are unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank you very much for your remarks and the insights you shared today. And we'd love for it if there was an opportunity for us to somehow debrief with you after you meet with Prime Minister Medvedev, and perhaps we could do that through our online conference area to which you have access, and where I encourage all of our attendees to post their questions and comments for Jochen.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And do come to Moscow one of these days.